Looking back, that dam symbolized more than just a fix for flooding. It was a symbol of independence, of fighting back against a problem no one else cared to solve. It showed me that I didn't have to just accept being the victim of bad circumstances. I could take action, build something, and protect what was mine. And for those few weeks before the HOA came knocking, I lived in You won't believe this. My homeowners association hit me with a $250,000 fine just because I built a small dam on my own property. That's right, $250,000 for trying to protect my land. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke. But when I realized they were serious, I decided if they wanted my dam gone, I'd give them exactly what they asked for. And let's just say they regretted it. Here's the backstory. I live at the bottom of a hilly neighborhood. The kind of place that looks peaceful from the outside but hides problems that no one talks about until they hit you directly. When I first moved in, I was excited. The houses were charming, the streets lined with tall trees, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. But what no one mentioned in the glossy real estate brochures, or in the HOA's welcome packet, was what happened every time a serious storm rolled through. Because of where my property sat, right at the lowest point of the entire subdivision, I became the unofficial dumping ground for all the rainwater that flowed down from the higher houses. Think of it like a funnel. Water would gush downhill, carrying mud, sticks, and debris. And where did it all end up? Right in my backyard. At first, I thought it was just bad luck. I told myself, it's just one storm. Things will dry out. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Every single time it rained heavily, my backyard turned into a swamp. The ground would get so saturated that it squished under my boots like a sponge. I couldn't even mow the grass because my lawnmower wheels would sink into the mud. But that wasn't the worst of it. My shed, which I had carefully stocked with tools, paint, and all the gear I needed for repairs around the house, became a victim of these floods. The first time, water seeped inside and ruined half my supplies. The second time, it got so bad that the foundation cracked and the wood started rotting. I remember opening the door after a storm and being hit with the smell of mildew and mud. It was like walking into a swamp. And then there was my garden. Gardening had always been my escape, my way to relax after a long day. I grew tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and even tried a few fruit trees. But nature didn't care about my hobbies. Each time the storms came, all the soil I had carefully tilled and fertilized washed away. Plants drowned. Roots rotted. I lost entire harvests in a single night. Watching months of hard work get destroyed by something I couldn't control was heartbreaking. So after years of frustration, I decided I couldn't just sit back and let it happen anymore. I had two choices: either sell my house at a loss and run away from the problem, or fight back. And since I had invested everything into that home, moving wasn't an option. That's when I came up with a plan. I would build a dam. Now, don't picture some massive, industrial concrete wall like the Hoover Dam. What I built was much smaller, more like a protective barrier designed to hold back water and redirect it safely away from my property. I started researching drainage solutions, reading about landscaping techniques, and even watching engineering videos online. I wasn't a professional, but I was determined. I got to work. First, I laid down a foundation of concrete blocks at the lowest point in my yard, the spot where the water always pooled. Then I reinforced it with large rocks I hauled in with a wheelbarrow, stacking them carefully so they wouldn't shift. To make sure the water didn't just build up behind the barrier and spill over, I installed a drainage system, PVC pipes and gravel trenches that would guide the water to a ditch running along the side of my property. It wasn't easy. There were days when I worked from sunrise to sunset, shoveling dirt, mixing cement, and dragging heavy materials by hand. My back ached, my hands blistered, and my neighbors probably thought I had lost my mind. But little by little, the project took shape. What started as a desperate idea turned into something solid, something real. Finally, after weeks of effort, it was done. My private dam stood firm at the edge of my yard, modest but sturdy. And the timing couldn't have been better, because only a few days later, the skies opened up. I'll never forget standing on my porch that night, watching the storm roll in. The rain hammered down, the wind howled, and the water came rushing down the hill, just like it always did. But this time, something was different. Instead of flooding my yard, the water hit the dam, pooled briefly, and then slid smoothly into the drainage system I had built. It was like watching a miracle unfold. For the first time in years, my land was dry after a storm. My shed didn't take on water. My garden, though battered by the rain, wasn't drowned. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of victory I hadn't experienced in so long. It was proof that sometimes, when no one else steps in to help you, you can take matters into your own hands and solve the problem yourself. I can't even describe the relief I felt in that moment. After so many sleepless nights worrying about the next storm, I could finally breathe easy. I remember thinking, why didn't I do this sooner? But here's the irony. The dam that saved my property was the very thing that triggered the HOA's wrath later on. At the time, I thought I had found the perfect solution. What I didn't realize was that my victory was about to spark a battle with people who cared less about safety and more about rules written on paper. See, no flooding, no ruined garden, no soggy, useless shed. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had stood up to nature and won. But then the HOA found out. At first, I wasn't even sure how they discovered the dam. I hadn't advertised it. I didn't post about it online. I didn't brag to the neighbors. Honestly, I thought no one would even notice since it sat at the far back of my yard, away from prying eyes. But you know how HOAs are. Nothing escapes their radar for long. Whether it was a nosy neighbor peeking over the fence or one of the board members casually walking past my property, someone spotted the new addition. And instead of asking me about it directly, they went straight to the board. A week later, I got the letter. Emergency HOA meeting. Attendance required. Now, if you've never dealt with an HOA before, let me paint the picture. These meetings aren't exactly friendly get-togethers. They're more like miniature courtrooms, where a handful of self-appointed neighborhood rulers get to sit at a long table, shuffle papers around, and act like they're running the Supreme Court. I walked in, already feeling like I was on trial. The room was full of folding chairs arranged in rows, with the HOA board members sitting at the front. There were about 6 of them, all in neatly pressed clothes, looking as serious as if we were discussing international politics instead of a small backyard project. A few curious neighbors had shown up too, probably hoping for some drama. Mr. Last Name, the chairwoman began, adjusting her glasses as she shuffled through a stack of documents. It has come to our attention that you've constructed a structure on your property that may be in violation of our community guidelines. I raised my eyebrows. You mean my dam? Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, as if I had just confessed to building a nuclear reactor in my backyard. The chairwoman nodded gravely. Yes, your dam. According to our records, no such structure was submitted for approval. Furthermore, our bylaws strictly prohibit any construction that alters the natural water flow within the community. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. With all due respect, it's not like I've changed the course of the Mississippi River. I just built a small barrier to stop my property from flooding. That's it. The dam isn't hurting anyone. One of the board members, a tall man in a suit that looked a little too formal for a neighborhood meeting, leaned forward. That's where you're wrong. Your unauthorized structure could redirect water in unpredictable ways. What if it caused damage to other homes? What if it created liability issues for the association? I let out a bit of laugh. Unpredictable? You mean like the predictable floods I've been dealing with for years because no one here cared enough to fix the drainage problem? My dam doesn't cause damage, it prevents it. The board exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed with my defense. To them, rules were rules. It didn't matter that my shed had been ruined twice or that my garden was wiped out every storm. All they cared about was that I hadn't asked for permission. Mr. Last Name, the chairwoman said again, this time in a sharper tone. This isn't about your personal struggles. This is about maintaining uniformity and safety within the community. Unauthorized structures undermine both. I felt my blood pressure rising. Uniformity? Are you serious? We're talking about water destroying my property, not about paint colors or mailbox styles. I solved a problem that no one else was willing to address. And now you're telling me that because I didn't fill out the right form, I'm the bad guy. That's when they pulled out the big guns. The tall man cleared his throat and read from a printed notice. The association has voted unanimously to issue a directive. You must remove the dam within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in fines of up to $250,000. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. $250,000? For building something in my own backyard? That's insane. The room went dead silent. Even a few of the neighbors sitting in the back looked shocked. But the board didn't flinch. It's not insane, Mr. Last Name, the chairwoman replied coldly. It's enforcement. Our guidelines are clear. Any unapproved structure may be subject to substantial fines. This is to ensure compliance and fairness across the community. Fairness, I shot back. Where was the fairness when my shed got ruined twice? Where was the fairness when my garden drowned? No one from this board lifted a finger to help me. But the second I actually fixed the problem myself, suddenly you care. Another board member, a woman with a clipboard who had barely spoken until then, finally chimed in. You should have gone through the proper channels. We have procedures for a reason. If every homeowner just built whatever they wanted, this community would be chaos. I couldn't believe the hypocrisy. Chaos. You worried about chaos? You think my little dam is chaos? Do you know what real chaos looks like? It looks like my backyard turning into a swamp every time it rains. It looks like hundreds of gallons of water flooding my shed. That's chaos. What I built is order. But my words fell on deaf ears. The board had already made up their minds long before I stepped into that room. They weren't interested in solutions. They weren't interested in safety. They were interested in control. The chairwoman tapped her pen against the table, signaling that the discussion was over. You have your directive. 30 days to remove the dam. If you do not comply, the fines will begin to accrue. I walked out of that meeting in a daze. My neighbors' eyes followed me as I left, some of them pitying, others judgmental. I could almost hear their thoughts. What was he thinking? Building a dam without approval. Didn't he know the HOA wouldn't stand for it? Outside, the night air felt heavy. My hands were trembling, not just from anger but from disbelief. $250,000. That was more than my entire yearly salary. More than the cost of rebuilding my shed 10 times over. More than I could ever realistically pay. All because I tried to protect my own property. In that moment, I realized something important. It didn't matter how reasonable my explanation was. It didn't matter that my dam actually improved the situation for everyone. To the HOA, I had broken the rules, and nothing else mattered. And that's when the anger started to shift into something else. Determination. If they wanted me to tear down the dam, fine. But they hadn't thought through what would happen once it was gone. Because Mother Nature doesn't care about HOA rules. And neither, at that point, did I. At first, I was furious. Furious isn't even a strong enough word for what I felt when I first read that fine notice. It was a surreal kind of anger. The kind that makes your hands shake, your chest tighten, and your thoughts race so fast you can't even put them into words. $250,000. A fine bigger than my mortgage. Bigger than the cost of my entire house. Bigger than anything I had ever seen written on a single sheet of paper with my name attached. I remember pacing around my kitchen, holding the letter in my hands like it was some kind of sick joke. I must have read it 10 times over, my eyes darting back to that number, each time hoping maybe I'd misread it. But no, there it was in bold print. $250,000. How is this even legal? I muttered out loud to myself. My dog looked up from his spot on the floor, ears perked, as if he too couldn't believe it. That night, I barely slept. I sat at the table with a notebook, scribbling down ideas, calculations, arguments. My head spun with possibilities. Maybe I could appeal it. Maybe if I hired a lawyer, they'd back down. Maybe if I explained the engineering behind the dam, they'd realize it wasn't some reckless backyard stunt. By the time morning came, I had convinced myself there had to be a reasonable way forward. I wasn't some troublemaker trying to defy rules for fun. I was just a homeowner protecting my property. Surely, if I presented the facts, the HOA board would listen. So I tried. I reached out, first with a polite email. I offered to hire an independent inspector, someone with real credentials, who could come and evaluate the dam objectively. If the inspector found it dangerous, I take responsibility and modify it. If they found it safe, then the HOA would have to admit they'd been wrong. It seemed like a fair compromise. No reply. So I followed up with a phone call. The HOA's secretary picked up, her voice sharp, professional, and completely devoid of empathy. Mr. Last Name, the board has already made its decision. The structure must be removed. I pressed on. But don't you think it's worth at least reviewing? I can pay for the inspection myself. No cost to the HOA. Doesn't that sound reasonable? There was a pause, then a sigh. The board isn't interested in inspections. The rules are the rules. Click. End of call. Still, I didn't give up. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up with everything I could prepare. Diagrams of the dam, printouts of drainage studies I'd found online, even photos showing how my property flooded before and how much safer it was now. I laid it all out on the table, like a student presenting his final project. But the board members barely looked at the papers. One of them tapped his pen impatiently. Another scrolled on her phone, not even pretending to pay attention. Finally, the chairwoman leaned forward, her voice calm but dripping with condescension. Mr. Last Name, this is not about your diagrams or your research. This is about compliance with the rules. You built a structure without approval. That is the only fact that matters here. I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. But the rules are supposed to protect us, right? To keep the community safe and organized? That's exactly what I did. I made my property safer. Doesn't that count for anything? The chairwoman shook her head. Safety isn't the issue. Uniformity is. Uniformity. That word echoed in my mind like a bad joke. They were more concerned about appearances, about things looking neat on paper, than they were about actual homes being destroyed by floods. It was like arguing with a brick wall. The more sense I tried to make, the more stubborn they became. It wasn't logic they wanted. It wasn't a solution. It was submission. That was when the realization finally hit me like a punch in the gut. They didn't want a solution. They wanted power. The $250,000 fine wasn't about money, at least not entirely. It was about control. It was about sending a message. We are in charge here. You do not get to act on your own. You do not get to fix problems without our blessing. You either obey or you suffer. I started replaying every past interaction I'd ever had with the HOA. The time they sent me a warning letter because my grass had grown half an inch too high after a week of nonstop rain. The time they scolded me for leaving my trash bins out a few hours past pickup. The time they argued about the color of my front door, saying it was slightly too bold for the neighborhood palette. Individually, those things had seemed petty. Annoying, sure, but manageable. But now I saw the pattern. This wasn't about community or fairness. This was about control for control's sake. Power disguised as guidelines. Authority dressed up as aesthetics. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I pictured the board members in their comfortable homes up on the hill. Houses that never saw an inch of flooding because the water always drained downhill into my yard. They never had to wade through ankle-deep mud to rescue their belongings. They never had to throw away rotted wood, moldy drywall, or ruined plants. And yet here they were, dictating to me what I could and couldn't do to protect my home. It was hypocrisy at its finest. I looked around that meeting room, at their smug faces, at their self-satisfied expressions, as if they'd won something by shutting me down. That's when my fury started to harden into something else. Not despair, not defeat, but resolve. If they wanted to fight, fine. But they needed to remember something. Nature doesn't play by HOA rules. And when the next storm came, the board members sitting so high and mighty would learn firsthand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of unchecked water. Because without my dam, there was nothing stopping the flood. Nothing at all. Weeks went by, and with each passing day, the weight of the HOA's wrath pressed heavier on my shoulders. At first, I thought maybe they'd lose interest, that this was just one of those empty threats designed to scare me into submission. But I was wrong. Every few days, like clockwork, another envelope arrived in my mailbox. Thick, cream-colored paper with the HOA's logo at the top, and always the same sterile, menacing tone. Failure to comply with removal of unauthorized structure will result in penalties. Your fines continue to accrue. This letter serves as a final warning before legal escalation. It was endless. Every time I opened one of those letters, it felt like a personal attack, like they were stabbing me over and over with words. I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how this had gotten so out of hand. I hadn't built a casino or a skyscraper in my backyard. I'd built a simple dam, a protective wall, something to keep my property from drowning. And yet, here I was, treated like a criminal. Then came the letter that finally broke me. This one wasn't from the HOA directly. It was from their lawyers. Heavy envelope, bold black type across the top of the page. Final notice. Tear down the dam within 10 days or face immediate legal action, including but not limited to liens, property seizure, and additional penalties. That was it. The line in the sand. When I read those words, my stomach dropped. Legal action. Property seizure. They weren't bluffing anymore. They weren't just threatening fines. They were threatening to take everything I'd worked for. My home. My land. My life as I knew it. I sat at the table staring at that letter for hours. The paper blurred in front of me. My mind raced with what-ifs. What if they actually followed through? What if the sheriff showed up at my door? What if my house was auctioned off? Everything I owned gone in a flash. I had fought so hard to stand my ground, to protect what was mine. But suddenly, it didn't feel like a battle I could win. And so, at that point, I stopped fighting. If they wanted the dam gone, fine. But as I made that decision, a bitterness burned in me like fire. They thought they'd won. They thought by crushing me with threats and legal jargon, they had forced me into submission. They didn't realize that every ounce of sweat I was about to pour into tearing down that dam was also planting the seeds of their own downfall. Because I knew something they didn't. Once the dam was gone, there would be nothing to hold back the storm. The dismantling begins. The next morning, I put on my work gloves, grabbed my tools, and walked to the backyard with heavy steps. The dam stood there, solid and proud, the product of weeks of backbreaking labor. Looking at it, I felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. It wasn't just a pile of rocks and concrete. It was a symbol of resilience, my defense against the chaos of nature. And now, I was about to destroy it. I started with the rocks I had stacked by hand. One by one, I pried them loose, each stone heavier than it looked. The first few came out easy, but as I worked deeper, the mud clung to them like cement. My gloves tore against the jagged edges. My arms burned from the effort. Sweat poured down my face even though the sun was barely up. As the hours dragged on, I thought about all the time I'd spent building this thing. The weekends I gave up. The sore muscles. The nights I went to bed exhausted but satisfied because I had created something that worked. And now, I was undoing it all, not because it failed, but because people in suits decided it didn't fit their vision of aesthetics. The sound of rocks clattering into piles echoed through the yard, each thud like a nail in the coffin of my hard work. The first house it reached belonged to Mr. Suit and Tie, the board member who had lectured me about liability issues. His perfectly manicured lawn didn't stand a chance. Water surged across it like a tidal wave, ripping up flower beds, flattening decorative shrubs, and swallowing his expensive lawn ornaments whole. The shiny black car parked in his driveway sat helpless as the flood climbed its tires, inching higher by the second. Next, it hit the chairwoman's property. The very same woman who told me safety isn't the issue, uniformity is. Well, there was no uniformity now. Water blasted through her white picket fence, splintering wood like matchsticks. I could see her from my porch, running out in a raincoat, waving her arms in panic as the flood surged closer to her front steps. She screamed for her husband, who was already dragging sandbags from the garage in a desperate attempt to block the water. But sandbags were no match for a storm of this size. Within minutes, water was pouring across her porch and slamming against her door. Then came the others. One by one, each board member's house fell under attack. Basements filled. Lawns disappeared under murky brown water. Trash bins floated away, spinning like toys in the current. Cars honked as their alarms shorted out. The once pristine neighborhood was now a scene of chaos, like a disaster movie unfolding in real life. I should have felt sympathy. But standing there, drenched to the bone, I couldn't help but feel something else entirely: vindication. This wasn't revenge. I hadn't done anything. Next came the concrete foundation. Breaking it apart was brutal. I swung a sledgehammer again and again, the vibrations rattling up my arms, my shoulders screaming in protest. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface until finally, chunks broke free. Dust clouded the air. My back ached with every swing, but I kept going. 2 days. That's how long it took. 2 full days of grueling, back-breaking labor. By the end, my hands were blistered raw, my clothes soaked with sweat and mud, and my muscles felt like they were on fire. And there it was, my backyard once again bare, open, vulnerable. The channel I had worked so hard to control was now wide open, the water free to rush through whenever the skies decided to open up. I stood there, staring at the wreckage, my chest heaving. It felt like burying a loved one. Something I had cared for, fought for, sacrificed for, gone, reduced to rubble. But I had done exactly what they wanted. The emotional aftermath. That night, I collapsed into bed, every part of me sore. But even more painful than the physical exhaustion was the emotional weight. I felt hollow, defeated. I thought back to that boardroom, the smug faces of the HOA members, their clipped voices, their obsession with rules. They didn't see me as a person. To them, I was just another case file, another problem homeowner, to be brought into line. I had offered compromise. I had offered inspection. I had offered reason. But they didn't want any of that. They wanted dominance. And now they had it. At least, that's what they thought. Because as I lay there in the dark, something inside me shifted. Yes, I had torn down the dam. Yes, I had complied. But I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen the next time a storm rolled through. I had warned them. I had told them the dam was the only thing standing between safety and disaster. And now, with it gone, it wasn't just my property at risk. Theirs was too. The irony burned in my mind. In their hunger for control, they had sealed their own fate. Nature didn't care about community guidelines or lawyer letters. When the rain came, it would carve its own path, and no amount of HOA paperwork would stop it. And deep down, a small part of me, the part that had been bullied, silenced, humiliated, almost wanted the storm to come. Foreshadowing the storm. Over the next week, I tried to go about my normal routine. Work, chores, small repairs around the house. But every time I stepped into my backyard, I felt exposed. Vulnerable. The soil looked dry for now. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the clouds gathered again. The neighbors whispered. Some gave me sympathetic looks, others smug ones, as if they thought I had learned a lesson. I kept my head down, but inside I seethed. On the 10th day, the exact deadline the lawyers had given me, I took photos of my dismantled yard and sent them to the HOA office. Proof of compliance. Proof that I had done my part. Their response. A curt, one-sentence email. Your compliance has been noted. That was it. No thanks. No acknowledgement of the work I had done. No concern about what the future might bring. Just a cold stamp of victory. And that was when I knew, with absolute certainty, that when the rains returned, they would finally understand. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wished harm on anyone. But because sometimes the only teacher powerful enough to humble arrogance is nature itself. And nature, as I would soon learn, was preparing a lesson that none of us would forget. And then, like fate itself was watching, a massive storm rolled in just a week later. It started quietly, almost deceptively. The morning was humid, the air thick with that electric heaviness that always comes before a downpour. Dark clouds gathered at the horizon, slow and steady, until the sky looked bruised and angry. Birds disappeared. The wind grew restless, bending tree branches in warning. I could feel it in my bones. Something big was coming. At first, the rain was gentle, a light drizzle, tapping softly on the roof of my porch. The kind of rain that would normally make you want to grab a book and a cup of coffee. But there was no comfort in this one. This was the opening act. I knew it. Within an hour, the drizzle turned into a steady rain. The gutters overflowed. Puddles formed in the street. I sat on my porch, watching, waiting. I had seen this pattern before, countless times, and I knew exactly what was next. Then it came. The sky opened up as if some giant hand had tipped over a bucket. Sheets of water poured down, slamming into the earth, pounding against roofs, tearing through yards. Thunder cracked like artillery fire, shaking the windows. The rain wasn't falling anymore. It was attacking. And that's when I saw it. The water rushing down the hill. It moved like a living thing, surging faster and faster, gathering strength with every inch it traveled. Without my dam to stop it, nothing stood in its way. My yard was the first casualty. Water tore through the soil, carving channels into the ground I had worked so hard to protect. It swallowed what little grass had survived the last storms, turned the earth into mud, and kept going. I stood frozen on my porch, rain pelting my face, watching in both awe and dread. It was exactly what I had warned them about, exactly what I had tried to prevent. The water didn't stop at my property line. Oh no, it wanted more. It spilled into the street, carrying branches, leaves, and chunks of debris with it. What had started as a trickle hours before was now a full-blown river, roaring down the hill, unstoppable. And then it headed straight toward the houses at the bottom of the neighborhood. Guess whose homes those were? That's right, the HOA board members. The flood unleashed. Oh, cause this. I had simply removed the one safeguard that had stood between my neighborhood and nature. They had ordered me to tear it down. And now they were learning, the hard way, what happens when you value aesthetics and rules over reality. Watching the consequences. From my porch, I had a front row seat to the chaos. The rain blurred everything into streaks of gray, but I could still make out the figures of my neighbors stumbling through the water. I saw one of the board members, soaked to the skin, dragging garbage bags to try and plug the flow at his garage door. Another family was frantically moving furniture upstairs, shouting at each other over the roar of the storm. The HOA president herself stood in knee-deep water in her driveway, her hair plastered to her face, trying in vain to direct traffic away from her property. But the water didn't care. It didn't listen. It didn't stop. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Weeks earlier, I had stood in front of those same people, explaining calmly, logically, that without the dam, disaster would strike. And now here it was, plain as day, flooding their lives in a way my words never could. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The emotional storm inside me. But here's the thing. As satisfying as it was to see poetic justice unfold, it wasn't pure joy. Watching people's homes, their safe places, their sanctuaries, go underwater stirred something complicated in me. I didn't wish for them to suffer. I never wanted their kids to cry over ruined toys, or their families to lose precious memories. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the sense of righteousness. This wasn't my fault. This was theirs. They had forced my hand. They had made me tear down the dam. They had dismissed every warning, every attempt at compromise, every shred of common sense. And now they were living with the consequences of their arrogance. It was as if the storm itself had become my witness, a force of nature proving, beyond any argument, that I had been right all along. The storm's peak. For hours, the rain didn't let up. Thunder boomed overhead like a war drum. Lightning split the sky into jagged veins of white. The river tearing through our neighborhood grew wider, faster, angrier. My backyard, gone. My shed, half submerged. My garden, a mud pit. But you know what? I was prepared. I had moved my tools, stored my valuables, and taken precautions because I knew what was coming. The board members hadn't. Their basements filled to the windows. Their driveways became rivers. Their once perfect homes, which had passed every aesthetic guideline, were now soggy, ruined, and broken. I leaned against my porch railing, drenched but unshaken, and whispered to myself, "This is what power looks like. Not theirs. Nature's." The aftermath. By dawn, the storm had finally begun to weaken. The rain tapered off to a drizzle, leaving behind a neighborhood that looked like a battlefield. Mud everywhere. Trash strewn across lawns, furniture floating in yards, cars abandoned in the middle of the street. And the HOA board members? They were broken. Their homes had taken the worst of it, sitting directly in the path of the flood. I could see them standing outside, soaked and exhausted, staring at the wreckage of their once pristine properties. Their faces told the story: disbelief, anger, despair. For me, the damage was there, sure, but manageable. For them, it was catastrophic. And in that moment, standing on my porch with the sun trying to peek through the gray clouds, I realized something. They had learned the hard way. The rules they clung to so desperately meant nothing against the force of nature. Their power was an illusion. Their control was a joke. Because when the storm came, all that mattered was who was prepared. And I had been ready. The sight was unbelievable. When the storm peaked, it was as if the entire neighborhood had been dropped into the middle of a disaster movie. Water wasn't just running downhill anymore. It was roaring, tearing, swallowing everything in its path. I stood on my porch, soaked through, gripping the railing, and all I could think was, this is exactly what I warned them about. The first signs of catastrophe showed up in the basements. At first, you could see the faint glow of lights through basement windows. Then, as the water crept up, those lights flickered and went out one by one. I could imagine the scene inside. Cardboard boxes floating, furniture legs bobbing, carpets soaked, and entire rooms becoming indoor swimming pools. Next, the lawns. The manicured grass, trimmed edges, and carefully planted flowers that the HOA cared so much about. Gone. Their green pride turned into a swampy mess of mud, weeds, and swirling debris. Flower beds disintegrated into puddles of brown mush. Decorative mulch floated like rafts, clumping against fences and driveways. Expensive landscaping projects that had cost thousands of dollars disappeared in a matter of minutes. Then came the cars. Luxury SUVs and shiny sedans, the kind the board members loved to polish every weekend, were now half submerged in muddy runoff. The waterline crept higher and higher up the doors, setting off alarms that blared uselessly into the storm. Horns honked, lights flashed, but there was no one to rescue them. Engines gurgled and died as floodwater swallowed them whole. I saw one neighbor wade chest deep through the torrent to try and move his car, but it was too late. The current was too strong, the water too high. He stumbled back toward his house, defeated. And then the worst part, water pouring through front doors. It started as a trickle at the thresholds. The kind of thing you'd think a towel could fix. But within minutes, the pressure built, and the water surged inside like it had been waiting for the chance. Living rooms, kitchens, hallways, all filling fast. Rugs floated. Chairs toppled. Cabinets warped. All the nice furniture and spotless interiors the HOA had bragged about at meetings were now being claimed by the storm. The very people who had fined me $250,000 were running around in pure panic. I watched the board members scramble like ants in a flooded anthill. They shouted over the roar of the rain, their voices tight with fear. Some grabbed sandbags and tried to line their doorways, but the water simply pushed them aside. Others ran with buckets, desperately scooping water out of their garages, as if they could fight a river with a plastic container. One man shoved towels under his door only to have them float away seconds later. It was chaos. I saw the HOA president, the same woman who had signed the letter threatening me with legal action, standing in her driveway, knee-deep in water, arms flailing as she shouted orders at her husband. He was dragging heavy storage bins up their front steps, water sloshing around his knees, his face pale with shock. Behind them, their dog barked hysterically from inside the house, trapped on the couch as the water crept higher. Another board member, the one who had smugly lectured me about community aesthetics, was waist-deep in his garage, desperately trying to stack bags of fertilizer and tools onto shelves that were already tipping. He slipped, cursed, and slammed his fists into the rising water before stumbling back, defeated. And the irony of it all? They were doing exactly what I had done for years, fighting a battle against water they could never win. Meanwhile, my property wasn't untouched, but I wasn't suffering nearly as badly. Yes, the water rushed through my yard. Yes, the ground was ruined, and my garden was gone yet again. My shed, which had already taken beatings before, had water creeping at its base. But here's the difference. I had been prepared. After they forced me to dismantle the dam, I didn't just sit there waiting for disaster. I moved my valuables to higher ground. Tools and supplies went into waterproof containers. Important documents were upstairs in sealed boxes. I even set up makeshift barriers around my doors. Not enough to stop a river, but enough to buy me time. So while my neighbors were in full-blown crisis mode, running around with sandbags and shouting for help, I was calm. The damage for me? Minimal. A headache, sure, but manageable. For them, a nightmare. And the most surreal part was watching the board members, the very people who had spent weeks sending me threatening letters, fining me, mocking my dam, and lecturing me about rules. Now learning the hard way that rules don't stop rain. Rules don't block a flood. Rules don't care when nature decides to unleash its fury. I remember locking eyes with one of them across the street. He was waist deep in water, clutching a sandbag, his hair plastered to his forehead. His face was twisted in desperation, and when he saw me standing dry on my porch, he froze. For just a second, his expression shifted, recognition, regret, maybe even shame. Then he turned away, swallowed by the chaos. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning split the sky, and still they fought in vain. I couldn't hear their words over the roar of the storm, but I didn't need to. Their actions said everything. Frantic, helpless, desperate. And I just stood there, the rain dripping from my clothes, thinking, you wanted the dam gone. Now you're living with the consequences. The poetic justice. It felt like fate had staged the entire event. Only a week earlier, they had celebrated their victory over me. They had forced me to tear down the one thing that kept all of us safe. They had waved their authority in my face, confident that the rules were on their side. And now, those same rules had left them defenseless. There's a word for it, karma. The universe doesn't always balance the scales immediately. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes just a week. But that night, under the roar of the storm, the scales tipped. And the irony wasn't lost on me. They fined me $250,000 for trying to protect my property, claiming my dam was an unauthorized structure. Yet here they were, standing knee-deep in floodwater, desperately building makeshift dams out of sandbags and trash bags. Unauthorized, unapproved, and totally ineffective. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. If anyone had filmed the scene, no one would believe it wasn't scripted. The same people who had accused me of altering natural water flow were now screaming for help because nature had altered their lives in ways they never imagined. And me, I wasn't untouched, but I was standing. I was prepared. My losses were nothing compared to theirs. That night, as I stood on my porch and watched them scramble, I realized something important. Power doesn't come from titles or rules or fines. Real power comes from understanding the world around you and preparing for it. They had tried to control me with paperwork. I had tried to control nature with common sense. And in the end, nature sided with me. By dawn, the rain slowed, the flood began to recede, and the neighborhood looked like a war zone. But that's a story for the next chapter, because the real drama was only just beginning. When the HOA members had to face me, the next morning, the neighborhood looked like something out of a disaster zone. The storm had moved on, but its mark was everywhere. Lawns that once looked like magazine covers were buried under mud and debris. Cars sat crooked, water-stained, and lifeless. Trash bins, flower pots, even entire patio sets had floated halfway down the street. The smell of wet wood, mold, and gasoline hung heavy in the air. I walked outside with a cup of coffee in hand, surveying the wreckage. My property had taken a hit, sure. The garden was gone, the shed waterlogged again. But compared to the destruction I saw around me, I almost felt lucky. I had prepared. I had expected this. The same couldn't be said for the HOA board members. Their houses, the ones sitting at the very bottom of the hill, had taken the worst of it. Basements filled to the ceiling. Drywall soaked and collapsing. Furniture ruined. Electrical systems fried. The pride and polish they had built their reputations on were gone overnight. And that's when I got the message. Emergency HOA meeting. Attendance required. I nearly spit my coffee out laughing. Another emergency meeting? These people hadn't learned a thing. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see their faces, hear their excuses. So I went. The meeting of shame. The HOA's usual meeting place was the clubhouse, a neat little building that suddenly didn't feel so neat anymore. The carpet squished underfoot. Buckets caught water from the still leaking ceiling. The smell of mildew hit the air. And there they were, the mighty board members, slumped in folding chairs, looking more like survivors of a shipwreck than community leaders. They were a sight to behold. Hair unbrushed, clothes wrinkled, dark circles under their eyes from sleepless nights. You could see the weight of their ruined homes pressing down on them. Gone were the smug smiles, the crisp suits, the condescending tones. They were broken, humbled, and desperate. The president cleared her throat. Her voice cracked, and for once, it wasn't the commanding bark she usually used. It was shaky, almost pleading. "Thank you for coming," she said, her eyes darting around nervously. We've had some serious damage, as you all know." "No kidding," I thought, biting back a smirk. Then she looked right at me. "And we realize now that your dam, it might have prevented some of this." The room went quiet. Heads nodded slowly. Nobody wanted to admit it outright, but the truth was finally unavoidable. And then came the kicker. Would you consider rebuilding your dam?" I almost choked. After everything, the threats, the lectures, the $250,000 fine. Now they wanted me to rebuild? Not just allow it, but ask me to? The irony was so thick I could have spread it on toast. I couldn't help it. A laugh slipped out. Not loud, not cruel, but enough for them to hear. A few board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms, and let the silence stretch just long enough for them to squirm. "Let me get this straight," I finally said. "You fined me $250,000 for building that dam. You threatened me with legal action. You forced me to tear it down. And now, after your homes get flooded, you want me to rebuild it?" The president's face turned red. Another board member muttered something about extreme circumstances. Someone else mumbled, "We didn't know it would get this bad." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but I did know. I warned you. Repeatedly. And you didn't listen. So tell me, why on earth would I help you now?" The power shift. That was the moment I realized the tables had turned completely. For months, they had held power over me, sending letters, enforcing rules, dangling fines over my head like a guillotine. But now, they had nothing. They needed me, and I wasn't about to let that slip by. So I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and said, "I'll think about it, but only under one condition." They all leaned in desperate. "You cover every single penny of the rebuild. Materials, labor, everything. And you drop all fines against me. Permanently. No exceptions." You could have heard a pin drop. The president blinked at me, stunned. Another board member opened his mouth like he was about to argue, but then quickly shut it again. They exchanged glances, their pride battling their desperation. I smiled. Because let's be honest, suddenly aesthetics don't matter, do they? Suddenly, rules don't matter. What matters is keeping your homes dry. And I'm the only one here who knows how to do that. Silence. Then slowly, heads began to nod. The taste of justice. I can't lie, it felt good. For months, they had dismissed me, humiliated me, tried to bully me into submission. And now here they were, practically begging for my help. The same dam they had called an unauthorized structure was now their only hope. It was more than just justice. It was validation. Proof that I hadn't been crazy, reckless, or irresponsible. Proof that I had been right all along. But more than that, it was sweet irony. The very people who fined me $250,000 were now asking me to name my price. The same board members who said my dam altered the natural flow of water were now praying I would alter it again, this time for their benefit. And the best part, they couldn't do a thing without me. None of them had the skills, the knowledge, or the grit to take on a project like that. They could barely keep their basements dry with sandbags. I held all the cards. Their desperation grows. One board member, the one who had always been the loudest critic, finally broke the silence. His voice trembled, his pride cracking like the drywall in his flooded basement. If we agree to your terms, will you rebuild it?" I let the question hang in the air. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own hypocrisy. I wanted them to sit with the reality that their precious rules had led them here. Finally, I shrugged. "Maybe. I'll think about it. But just so we're clear, if I do this, I'm not doing it for the HOA. I'm doing it for me. And the only reason you'll benefit is because you forced my hand in the first place. No one argued. No one dared. Because deep down, they all knew I was right. The new balance of power. Walking out of that meeting felt like walking out of a courtroom where the judge had just ruled in my favor. The air smelled fresher. The sky looked brighter. And for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt free. They could no longer bully me with their letters. They could no longer wave their rulebook in my face. They had lost the one thing they valued most, control. And the irony, they had lost it to the very person they tried to crush. From that day forward, every time I saw one of them mowing their destroyed lawns or hauling ruined furniture to the curb, I couldn't help but smile. Because I knew the truth. They knew the truth. Everyone knew the truth. When it came down to it, the HOA wasn't in charge anymore. Nature was. And I was the only one smart enough to respect that. And the rest of them? Well, they had learned the hard way. Face each other, and face the consequences of what they'd done. In the end, they had no choice but to agree. All their pride, all their threats, and all their so-called authority dissolved the moment they realized they needed me more than I needed them. After everything, the fines, the angry letters, the threats of legal action, it all came down to this, me. Standing there with the power to decide whether their homes would be safe the next time the clouds opened up. And so, I rebuilt my dam. But not just the same dam. I rebuilt it stronger, smarter, and more resilient than ever before. This time, it wasn't just a quick fix to protect my backyard. I invested every ounce of knowledge I had gained, every lesson learned from the first version, and every idea for improvement into the new structure. Reinforced walls, deeper channels, better drainage. I made sure that when the next storm came, not even the angriest floodwaters would stand a chance. And you know what? The HOA didn't say a single word. No complaints, no citations, no threats of fines. The very people who once called my dam an unauthorized structure were now watching in silence as I built the very thing that would save them. Their silence was more powerful than any apology. It was their way of admitting they had been wrong without actually speaking the words. When the dam was finished, I stepped back and looked at it with pride. My land was safe, my home was protected, and ironically enough, so were the homes of the HOA board members who had once tried to destroy me. The storm that had humiliated them had flipped the power dynamic upside down. They were no longer the ones dictating the rules, I was. And in that moment, the whole situation taught me something important. Sometimes, the people in power don't actually care about what's right. They don't care about fairness, or safety, or protecting the community. What they care about is control. They cling to their rulebooks, their fines, and their so-called authority because it makes them feel bigger than everyone else. It gives them a sense of power. But here's the truth. They only hold that power as long as people let them. When nature got involved, when the storm hit, all those petty rules didn't matter anymore. The HOA couldn't find the rain. They couldn't threaten the storm with legal action. They couldn't write up a violation notice for the floodwater. Nature exposed how powerless they really were. That's when I realized something even bigger. Life has a way of humbling people who misuse their authority. Sometimes, you don't even need to fight them directly. Sometimes, all you need to do is let reality run its course. And those same people who once tried to control you will come crawling back, begging for your help. And that's exactly what happened here. So, if you're ever stuck dealing with a power-hungry HOA, or any group of people who think they can control you just because they have a title or a rulebook, remember this story. Don't waste all your energy fighting on their terms. Sometimes, the smartest move is to step back. Let them feel the consequences of their own decisions, and then watch as they come full circle. Because eventually, their rules won't protect them. Their titles won't save them, and their pride will be swallowed by reality. In my case, all it took was one storm to show them the truth, one flood to wash away their arrogance, one disaster to reveal that my so-called unauthorized structure was the only thing standing between safety and destruction. So here's my advice. Play by their rules, if only to prove a point. Do what they demand, even if it doesn't make sense. And then, when their rules come back to bite them, you'll be standing tall, while they're scrambling for solutions. In the end, control doesn't really belong to them. It belongs to you, to the choices you make, and sometimes to forces bigger than any of us, like nature itself. And if you're smart enough to see that, then no HOA, no board, and no so-called authority can ever truly win against you.